Hi everybody, today we're going to take a look at making a cool hologram animation like this. You'll be able to adjust how hard or soft the hologram is. Mine is based off of a JS placement sprite map, but you could theoretically use pretty much any displacement texture you wanted to. Additionally, we'll look at how to create a cool sort of background or whatever you want to use this for. So to start off with, we're going to delete the default point light. Grab the cube, move it over a little bit, and then we're going to add images as planes. We're going to grab a texture. I'm going to use one from JS Placement. We're going to click Alt-R, S2. We're going to Control A and apply both the rotation and the scale. Now we're going to go over to the Modifiers tab. We're going to add an array, uncheck relative, check constant, reset them all to 0, and then we're going to move the Z up by just a tiny little bit. Then we're going to add count, and we're going to say 30 for now. Now we're going to pull this bottom tab up, Shift F3 over to the shader editor. We're going to move it over, move that over, and then unhook everything. Then we're going to get a gradient texture, Control T to add mapping to it. We're going to switch it from object to vector. Now we'll Control Shift click on it so we can see what we're doing and switch over to Eevee. Next, we're going to go ahead, click on the cube, click on our plane, Control L, link the materials. This is just so we can see all of the different orientations of the gradient. Now we'll click on options, switch it from alpha blend to alpha clip. That'll clean up the weird layering that's going on there. Then we'll turn the rotation on Y to 90. Then we'll add a math node, switch it from add to multiply. Then we'll add a map range node. So the multiply will just let us make the gradient larger or smaller, which can be helpful for adjusting the depth of the gradient. Then we can use the map range for fine tuning. We'll change this to like 0.5 and the max to -3. And what that'll do is it'll just invert the curve, and we'll tweak that more later as needed. Then we'll mix the panel height texture with the map range node. We'll change the mode to multiply, and we'll turn up the factor just a little bit right before things start turning completely black. Then we'll plug the multiply into the alpha, Control Shift click so we can see what the shader's doing, add ourselves a color ramp. Then as we turn up the white, you can see things start appearing. So what we've done is we've taken the base texture, which is a white to black texture, and we've multiplied it by a gradient that starts dark at the top and gets lighter as it goes down. And we've multiplied that by our base texture, meaning as it goes up, the dark spots get even darker, the mid spots stay kind of middle-ish, but the dark spots get darker faster than the light colors, which means we end up with a whole bunch of different heights. So the black gets cut completely, or nearly completely. We can probably get it to come back if we push this over far enough. And the white stays the tallest. And what you get is the whole bunch of different heights. And this can be used for some kind of cool effects on its own. Say if you needed to get a lot of detail like this, but you didn't want to have thousands or hundreds of thousands of polygons, which can really eat up VRAM, you can do something like this. And if we turn the layer count up to like 600, and then the Z depth way down, so it's just, zoom out so we can see what we're doing. So we're at 0.04, we need to go like a fifth of this. We'll do 0.0005. That's a little too much, so we'll go maybe 9. That's about getting there. And you can see that this actually looks pretty solid if you didn't know better. And one thing we can do to actually help this appear even more solid is we'll duplicate our texture, and we'll load a normal map for what we currently have. So this is panels. We'll grab a normal map, plug that in. We'll switch the sRGB to non-color, and that'll just help it kind of, the edges sort of crisp up a bit. So without it, if we turn this to 0, and as we turn it up, you can see the edges get kind of darker. which may or may not be something you want, but it's definitely something to note. It will also help it react to light a little better. So if we get the lamp back, a point light, move it up, we'll check scene lights, and we'll check scene world as well so it's darker. You can kind of see it sort of works. And it's always going to be a little bit odd because it's a really hard thing to render. Depending what you're trying to do, it could be really helpful. We'll also turn on contact shadows, which will help really crisp everything up. And this may be helpful for what you're doing, but what we're going to do today is actually use this for something else. I just wanted to show you this use case because it could be helpful for something you're doing, or at the very least, it's a good thing to know about. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete the normal map, and the principled BSDF. Then we're going to add a transparent shader, an emission shader. We're going to mix them together and plug the color into the factor, and then plug that into the output. And as you can see, that completely loses pretty much any and all depth perception. Like, you can't see any of the detail. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use this. What we're going to do is we're going to use this gradient to assign a darker color at the bottom and for it to get lighter as you go up, and this will help really differentiate all the layers. So let's see if we can get that to work. So first we're gonna reset this color ramp, and we're gonna clamp in the black. Oh, we have to view it, otherwise it's not gonna work. And we don't want quite this much difference, so we're gonna start off, instead of plugging into the map range, let's plug it into the multiply, see if that gets us more we want, and that's much better. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out what colors we want. For this, I'm going to do a like purplish, we'll do a dark kind of purpley blue, going to a light kind of icy blue. And we're going to plug that, move it up here, and we'll plug it into the color on the emission. And now let's see what that's looking like. So you can see that helped add a fair bit of definition. We can actually see the different shapes and blobs now. The next thing we're going to do is hop over back to our modifier tab, and we're going to turn this down to like 60 or maybe even 30. Because for what we're doing, we don't need nearly as much detail, and it will be a lot lighter to render. And we're just going to stretch it out. You can kind of see the different layers now, but that'll actually work fine for what we're doing. In fact, it might even improve the look. So this is easier to see what's going on, but I still want a little more differentiation here. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a light line on all of these edges. Basically, we're going to outline each of these big shapes. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our base texture. We're going to get a mix node, and we're going to switch it from multiply to subtract. And we're going to plug in our base texture with this new copy we've made, and we're going to add mapping coordinates to the copy. Then we're going to add a value node. Then we're going to add a combine XYZ. And we're going to plug that into the location. Then we're going to plug this. We're going to plug the value into the combine XYZ. And we're going to duplicate this whole block here. And we're going to plug the value into the X of this as well. Then we're going to get a math node, switch it from add to subtract, duplicate the subtract, plug our new texture we've just made into it, as well as the original panel texture. Now we're going to come down to our value. We're going to type in something real small, like 0.001, and we're going to change our multiply to -1. What this is doing is we're offsetting both of these coordinates by our small values, so it'll be 001. The bottom one is just being moved over on the x-axis, and the top one is moved on the x-axis, but in the opposite direction, so it's being moved the negative direction instead of the positive direction. Now, if we duplicate one of these mixes, plug both of our subtracts in, turn the factors up to 1 on all of these, and switch it from subtract to add. Now we'll preview this, and we can see it's not worked at all. Oh, we need to plug this UV into this vector as well. Now we'll try switching around this. There we go. And now we see we end up with some lines that are pretty much unintelligible for now. So now this one's almost working, but we actually need to switch this from subtract to multiply. And now you can see we've got, if you look at, say, a circle, we've got a line on the left, a line on the right, but the top and bottom are faded and don't quite have the line. So what we need to do is zoom back out, grab all of this, and duplicate it. Now we'll delete this value. We'll plug our first value into the y now instead of the x on both this combine xyz as well as the top of our multiply node. Now if we zoom back out, we can plug both of these into our base texture as well. Then we can duplicate one of these adds and plug both our bottom tree and our top tree into it. Now if we preview it, we'll see something's once again gone a little bit funky. Oh, we didn't change this top multiply into the y instead of the x. Now you can see we've got a solid circle, so all four sides are being offset and creating a line where they once were. Now we can take the output of this tree, duplicate the add, plug it in between our color ramp and our emission shader, and then plug the output of this tree into that add. Now if we preview what we've got, you can see it's done something, but it's pretty funky. And currently the lines we've made are on the outside of all of these shapes, which isn't actually what we want. We want it on the inside of them so we can actually see them on everything. So we'll just go through all of these subtracts, click Alt-S to switch the inputs. And now you can see instead of being on the bottom, these lines are on the top. And it outlines everything very nicely, and you can see there's way more definition and it's way easier to see what's going on with this now. Now let's clean up this whole tree a bit. So we'll move the value to the back. We'll hold shift, right drag over all these to combine it into one stream for clarity. Then we'll select this entire tree and click Control G, and that'll pop it all into its own little node group and make things much cleaner and easier to work with. We can just drag it right above where we're using it. We can also change the width of our lines by adjusting this value. Granted, we have to stay very small or else the effect will kind of fall apart. Now, if you want to get rid of these super dark patches that kind of clash with the style, you could leave them if they work for what you're doing. But for me, I'm just going to go in and click the clamp on all four of our subtract nodes. And that should reduce it so it's no longer going a super negative number and then we add everything together. Now, if we zoom out a bit and we come down to our mapping coordinate, what we can do, if we move the location up and down, we can kind of see it. It's kind of a cool animation effect, but it's a little basic. But we can remedy that. So let's go hop into edit mode, select one of the corner vertices of one of these, go cursor to selected, click tab again. We'll add an icosphere. Then we can scale it down, move it down a little, Control A, apply scale and rotation. The next thing we can do, we can duplicate this, click Y, 2, then click both, Shift D, X, 2, and that will give us 4 of them. Then we can grab one of them, scale it up a lot, grab one of them, scale it down a little bit, just to create some variation. Say if this is like a city or something, it creates a little bit of height variation so it's not all quite as repetitious. Then we can grab one of these, we'll rotate it by 90, rotate this one by -90, and rotate this one by 180. This will help just give it a little less repetition. It'll make it look less copied. Now what we can do is we can select all 4 of them, select our icosphere, we'll Control P, keep transform. Now what we'll do is we'll hop back into our shader, duplicate the gradient texture, Control T to add mapping to it. We'll mix it with our color ramp that's going into the mix shaders. We'll switch the mode to multiply, and we'll switch it from linear to spherical, switch the texture coordinate from generated to object, and we'll scroll down so we can actually see our icosphere, and we'll click the little eyedropper tool and select it. Now what it's doing is it's originating the spherical gradient texture in the middle of all 4 of our things instead of just on each of them individually. Now we can add a value node, plug it into this scale. What we can do is move this up. We can see it gives the effect that the whole thing is originating from the center point between all of these. We could theoretically make as many of these as we wanted. We're not necessarily limited to just 4. It is limited on the sphere, and as you get closer to 0, it will grow faster, so keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and get rid of these extra ones though, because we do not need them for what we're doing. Now let's go ahead and animate it. So we'll select one of them and go over to our first mapping node. Then we'll drag out from the bottom of the screen, get ourselves a timeline. Make that a little smaller. Click on the mapping node, move it to wherever we want our animation to end. Let's go with 90, and we'll click I to keyframe. We'll go back a little ways. We'll say to 60. And now let's just play around with it, move it till it's all gone. For me, it's like 0.7. Should work. Now, if we scrub through, we'll see it kind of all appears. But it's okay. It's a little bland though. So what we're going to do next is we'll also keyframe that circle we added. So if we come down to our value node, go to the end where it all appears. Let's actually clip in a little bit because I want it to stay just a tiny bit circular. We'll click I. Now we'll go back to before that. And for this, I'm actually going to offset it a bit from the vertical appearance because I think it'll look a little more interesting then. We're also going to have to figure out the value that it needs in the beginning, because if we scroll over here, we can't actually see it to adjust it. So we have to come over here. We'll just scroll it down. It looks like -5 will work, so we'll just go back to where we want that. Type in -5 and click I to keyframe it. Now, if we pan through, we can see it all sort of pops in. And I think the height needs to happen before the sphere. So we're going to select our first mapping node, and we're going to make it happen a little bit later. See how that's doing. Be a little too much. And now you can kind of see it's snapping in super quick. And that's because the closer to 0 our value gets, the bigger the sphere grows. So what we can do is go to the graph editor, and we can kind of tweak it so that it's closer to the speed we want just by adjusting the curves. So we'll switch it to Bezier so we can actually change them. And now we'll take the first one and we'll just stretch it to be straight because we don't actually want it to be slow at the beginning. We just want to slow down the end of it a bit. And we can stretch that out. And that makes it a little bit smoother. Let's also maybe tweak our sphere getting bigger as well. Or sorry, our height. Because I don't entirely like its movement currently. So we'll select the mapping node that the height's keyframed in, pop back over to the graph editor. We'll select it all, click T, Bezier to make that a curve as well. Now let's drop this down, and we don't actually need any of these keyframes except for the X. We'll delete the Z and the Y, and that'll make it simpler because we don't have all the extra curves. So let's actually, instead of making this one slow as it gets further, we'll make it speed up. See how that looks. Maybe we'll actually slow it down. Yeah, I think that actually looks a lot cleaner. So now what we can do, I mean, at this point, it's actually pretty close to animated. We can kind of tweak the material a bit, though. So let's turn the emission up just a tiny bit. And let's, to get this brighter, I want these outlines to actually be brighter. We'll add a math node. We'll switch it to multiply. And then we'll just turn it up to a little higher. Oops. To like 5 or something, so it pops a little more. You can obviously tweak that to taste, maybe a little less. Once we go negative, it goes black, which is pretty cool. We'll work with that for now. So now what we can do is we can actually like put this on something, so it's not just a floating hologram in space. Instead of parenting it to the icosphere, what I'm actually going to do is unparent, Alt P to clear parent, and we're going to keep transformation. And we're going to add an empty on the icosphere. Just, it'll give us more control. So we'll select all 4 of these. We'll select the icosphere, and we'll select the plane axes. And we'll parent and keep transform. Then what we will do is we will add let's scroll back so we don't actually see these. We'll add a mesh, we'll add a circle. We'll click tab to enter edit mode. Then we'll right click, subdivide, and we'll subdivide it like twice. Now what we can do is click F to fill. We'll scale this in a little bit. Then we'll click E, scale it out. We'll E to extrude it. We'll move it out a little bit. Then we'll E extrude again, scale that out a bit. E to extrude, E, then S to scale. Scale that out, extrude it, scale it, extrude it again, extrude it again, scale it. We're just gonna make some kind of interesting details. Then we'll scale this out a little bit further. We'll scale it up. This will be the rim of our table. We'll scale it out one more time. Move it down, scale it once more, move it down, scale it in, move that down, and then we'll kind of build a basic like table bottom, I don't know. You can do it as fancily or as simply as you would like. Then we will tweak some of this a little bit. Now I don't like just this single ridge, so we'll add an edge loop. We'll move it up. We'll switch our snapping mode from increment to vertex. Then we'll click G, Z, hold control, and we'll snap it to the next row in. That way they're at the same height. Then I'm going to take the next row in, scale it in a little bit so the angle's not quite so steep. I think that'll work for now. Next, we'll go to edge selection mode, and we're going to grab some of these, whichever ones we want, and we're just going to bevel them. Also, I've just realized that when I subdivided my circle, I forgot to turn on smoothing. So if you turn on smoothing when you subdivide your circle, it won't look as jagged as this. It'll be a nice round circle instead of a straight line, straight line, straight line, and it'll look a lot higher poly. I forgot to do that, but you can learn from my mistake and not forget to do that. And we'll select the table again, shade smooth. Let's also, for the smoothing's sake, grab the interior of these. And we'll bevel those just a little bit too. Now what we can do is we'll add a mesh torus, scale that out, click tab, alt S, and we'll scale it down so it's a much narrower circle. And what we're going to do is we're just going to scale it till it seems about right to fit right into this divot we made. And that seems good for that one. Then we're going to duplicate it, go into edit mode, scale it up again, alt S to make it a little bit smaller, maybe even smaller than the first circle. We'll drop that down a bit. Then we'll pop back in object mode, duplicate it one more time, make a nice small one right around the circle in the middle, and we'll scale it up. Now we'll take all three of these toruses, Control A, apply scale just so it doesn't mess anything up. Now let's add some real simple materials. For this I'm going to go for like kind of a Star Wars-y, very simple flat gray. We'll go for a dark gray on these, turn the roughness up a bit, and then we'll select all three of them, and we'll click Control L, link, and I'm also going to click Shade Smooth. Then we'll select the table. We'll add a material to that. We'll make it a slightly lighter gray. Then we're going to select all. We're going to click Alt-N, recalculate outside because there's a good chance the normals got flipped since we started with a circle. Now I'm going to use an add-on just to make it a little fancy here. You can use the Discombobulator add-on, which comes with Blender and does a very similar thing with a little less control. I'm just going to select a couple random areas here. We'll unselect that very edge. Then we'll click Shift Q. We'll add random loops. We'll select 2. We'll add a subdivision. It'll be a little tricky to see what this is doing, but if we edit or we leave edit mode, you can kind of see it's added some shapes here. We will select both of them. We will attempt to select both of them. We'll click Control J to join them. We'll edit mode, A to select all, and we'll just bevel this a tiny bit. That was too much. And that'll help just sharpen up all the edges. And you can see that's very subtle, but it adds a little extra detail to it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to parent all of these bits to our empty in the middle. There we go. Control P, keep transform, and we're going to go and delete this point light here. We don't need it. Then we'll just make sure it's all still animating correctly. To make our empty easier to grab, let's select it. We'll just click on it in the browser. Right click, adjust empty display size, and we'll make it a lot bigger so we can select it without having to dig through all of our stuff. Then we can just select it and give it a rotate and make sure everything here is rotating together. Let's make sure the table is also rotating, and it looks like everything is. So now what we'll do is we'll come back, figure out where this starts animating. So right about 70. And we'll select our middle one, move it up a bit. We'll click I, location. We'll select our icosphere. We'll also move it up a little bit. I, location. Now we'll pop back maybe 5 or 10 frames, and we'll select the next in circle. We'll move it up. I, location. Then we'll grab this last one, move it in a little bit more, maybe 5, 10 keyframes, and we'll move it up so it sits just below the previous one. Then we'll click I, keyframe that location as well. Now we'll move back a bit, move this down back into its kind of groove. Click I, location, grab this next one. Oh, let's move forward a little bit. Grab the next one, I, location, move forward a little bit more, move this down, I, location, and finally we'll grab our icosphere, move that down, forward a bit, move it down, keyframe that location as well. Now what we should have is kind of these all come up in sort of a wave, and then the projection emanates from there. We'll add something to make this icosphere a little less boring, so we'll add a new material. To find it, if we can't find it, we'll click A to select all, and then numpad 0 to hone in on it. Now we can delete the principled BSDF shader. We'll add an emission shader, as well as let's go with a refraction shader. Might look interesting. Then we'll combine them. We'll connect that to the output, and we'll make this color match our projection. So for this, we'll add like a blue, and we'll turn that brightness up a bit. And in the refraction, we'll add a dark blue, so it's a little bit more subtle. Now we can move this mix shader factor and switch between these two shaders. We'll turn this brightness up a little bit. And you could use any shader here for the refraction, but for this it doesn't matter too much, so I'm going to leave it. Now let's figure out where this starts projecting. We'll switch to our glowing. We'll click I to keyframe it. Then we'll go back to right around where it stops floating. We'll scroll this to the other side, keyframe that as well. Now, if we click space, we can kind of see it all pop up. It starts glowing, and then the projection comes from there. Now, we could leave it here, but let's add something to make the outside of this projector table more interesting. So we'll select it, we'll click tab, and we'll just select one of these loops to go around the outside. We'll shift D, make it a little smaller, and then P selection so it's in its own object now. Then we'll grab it, we'll go back into edit mode, we'll move it down a bit, scale it up a bit, click E to extrude, and then scale it in. So we get kind of this angled cone of sorts. Then we'll grab an edge, we'll click, I have mark seam put in my quick favorites, but if you don't have it, you can click edge, mark seam. Now we'll select it all, and we'll click U, unwrap. Let's hop over to UV editor so we can see what happened. We're going to select it all, click N, go down to the UV squares. If you don't have this button, you can install the UV squares add-on. I think it's default in Blender, but if it's not, you can probably just Google it and find it on GitHub instead. We'll click to grid by shape, and that'll make a nice line. And then we'll go UV, pack island, and we'll scale it up on the x-axis a whole bunch. Move it over so it's roughly centered, and scale it up some more. So it takes up the whole area. Now we'll go back to layout. Then we'll give it its own material. So we'll just remove the one that's on there. Click new, delete the principled BSDF, switch it from blend mode to opaque to alpha blend, then the shadow mode to none will work fine. Then we'll add a transparent shader and a emission shader. Mix them together. Plug that into the output. and we'll get a gradient texture. Then we'll add mapping to that, plug that into the factor of the mix shader, and you can see that's doing something, but it's not quite what we want. So we're going to want to rotate it on the Y. Looks like should work. And now you can see it goes from dark at the bottom to light at the top, but we want it the other way around. I'm also going to switch this from factor to color. I'm not sure if it makes a difference, but I'm going to. Then we'll plug the color ramp in. We'll switch it from linear to B-spline. We'll flip the color ramp. Now if we pinch this black in, we can see it makes this nice soft gradient. Then we can change the emission to be blue or purple. And we can turn it up a little bit, maybe a touch less saturated. And we can see it gets kind of this like ring of light effect. And we can pinch this down a fair bit and make it look more like there's a light bar on the outside with some light emitting from it. And that works, but it's a little bit boring. So one thing we can do is add a math node in between here. And we can use this math node to animate whether or not we can see it. So if we turn it to 0, we'll see it's exactly what we set up. And if we drag it down, we'll see it slowly disappears. So let's figure out when we want it to turn on. So right around 70, I think should work. We'll keyframe the 0. Then we'll drag it back a bit, maybe 10 frames to 60, and we'll drag it down so you can't see it at all. We'll do -2, should work, yep. And then we'll keyframe that. And now we can see it comes on, but it doesn't look, again, it's still kind of boring. So we'll go over to our graph editor. We'll make sure it's selected, and we can see we've got the keyframes. Then we will select it, go to modifiers, add modifier noise, and we can see now it flickers a whole bunch. But we don't want it before, we don't want it to flicker after, at least not that much, or before. So we'll go down to restrict frame range, and we'll end it where we made it turned on, which is 70, and begin, or at start, we'll take it from 0 to 60. And this means it'll only kind of flicker right as it's turning on. And it'll be a little hard to see. I'm not sure why this is so light. That's because there was no light before, so now it looks much lighter. So we'll go ahead and adjust these to be a bit darker again. Now it does flicker, but it doesn't flicker very much. So let's go ahead and adjust the settings to make it a little more noticeable. So we'll turn up the strength to make the flickers larger, and we'll turn the scale up a bit so they're a bit slower. Maybe something like, let's look for a shape we like. Turn that up a bit, see how this looks. I think that's actually too fast. Let's drag it back from 60 to 50, and we'll change this to 50 as well. So it just takes a little longer to turn on. I think that's a little too much. So it might be a little bit fast as well. We can also turn the blend in and out up a bit to make it a little less jarring. But I think they're pretty close to fine actually. There we go, I like that. So now it kind of gives it just a little flicker, which is just a little more life before it turns on. And now what we can do to make just a basic animation that'll be a little more exciting is we can keyframe this rotation at 0. We'll scroll over to maybe, we'll go with 180. We'll do RZ360, which will be exactly 1 turn, and then we'll I rotation and keyframe that. Now if we click play, we can see it just slowly rotates and turns on. I think I'm going to play around with just this material a little bit more as well, make it pop. So let's turn this emission up a tiny bit more. We'll turn the multiply up on this a little bit more, and we could even play around with making it darker instead of lighter if that would pop better. May not look as much like a projector, but it's a cool effect nonetheless. I'm going to leave it at positive. And if you want it to be a little less solid than this, one thing we can do is come down to where this last multiply is plugged in with the circle. And between this multiply and this color ramp, we're going to add something. So we're going to select these, move them out a bit. We'll add another multiply in right here. And we'll add a Voronoi texture. Then we can plug the distance into, we'll go with the second color on it. We'll turn the randomness down to 0. And we can turn the scale up. Although this is also a cool effect. You can use procedural textures to really mess with it and make it look either a lot more organic or just a lot less like it did originally. Let's play around with that for a bit. So if we turn the scale up a little bit, you might be able to see what it's doing better. And instead of using the Euclidean, which is very round, we could use something like Manhattan, which might give it a little more granular look. We can also turn this factor up a bit more to make it more or less intense. But if we just want to take what we originally had and make it a little more interesting, what we can do is turn this back to Euclidean, turn the scale way up, something like this, and we can see it gets a much more like classic hologram look. We can also try switching these, or no, sorry, we can get a color ramp, add it to here, flip it, and then it'll invert it. So if we zoom in, we can kind of see this is leaving dots, whereas if we flip this, you can see it's like cutting holes out of it. And you can choose whichever of those you like more. And you can see that makes it a much softer, more classic hologram look. But if you don't want it to be quite so soft, we can pinch this in. So it's just poking a little bit out. And we can even turn the scale up even more, like 300. And this will be a fairly subtle effect, but it could also add a lot of interest to it, especially if you're zooming in a lot. I would recommend maybe not doing this if you're going from very distant, although if you're doing more like this, then you could. But if you're going up for some really nice close-ups, say like this, we'll go and flip this again. So we can see just a little bit. It makes these lines a lot more interesting. And if you want to do close-up pictures, what you can do, let's zoom in, find a cool spot. We'll click Control-Alt-0 on the numpad to get a camera. We can turn up the pass per 2 to make it just black. We can check depth of field, turn it way down so we can really see what's going on. And now we'll just adjust the distance until we find a spot we like. And you can play with the f-stop to see if you want more or less in focus. If you want if you want it to look a little like a more cinematic, so a anamorphic camera, you can change this to like 1.5 or 2, which makes a very subtle difference in this, but basically just turns these, what would normally be these circles here, if we turn it back to 1, you can see how here they're circular. If we turn this up a bit, they become a bit like ovals, which is something that cinema cameras often make if they're anamorphic cameras. You can choose to leave that or take it. Something to note. So these close-up pictures could work really well for just backgrounds or something like that. I think it's a cool additional effect. That is blurry because motion blur's on. If we uncheck motion blur, this is a very cool effect that's very different, like a different result from the far away result. But if we zoom out and we go back to the beginning, we can really see how the whole effect looks. So let's just let it play through. Now also keep in mind this kind of blur. I don't know if you'll be able to see it with YouTube compression or not, but when you actually render, it will be rendered much sharper than it is in this preview. You can also switch the So now, if we just let it play, we can see the whole effect will play through. One last thing real quick is I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more interesting of a material to this base. So we'll just turn metallic all the way up. We'll turn roughness a fair bit down. We'll make sure auto smooth is turned on. Then we'll add a Musgrave. We'll click Control T to add mapping. We'll switch it to object coordinates. Then we'll plug this into roughness. And we'll add a color ramp. Then we'll turn the detail up to 15, the dimension down to 2, and we'll adjust the color ramp so the black is a little bit lighter and the white is just a little bit darker. Then let's go ahead and take this color and turn it maybe up a little bit. Clamp this just a little bit more. And then let's go into these, turn it down a little bit, make them like almost black. There you go. There's a little bit more interesting of material to have on that, on the base. I hope some of that was helpful and that you learned something new. That's all I've got for today, so I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.